And we're back. This is segment 3 of episode 400. Yes, we've reached the episode 400 of the Colombia Calling podcast. And my very special guest is none other. He needs no introduction. Is Adam Isacson from WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America. He's the Director for Defense Oversight, and he's a Colombia expert. And we all go to him for our quotes, or those journalists here. I mean, you are the go-to guy. You and Sergio Guzman. So welcome back on the Colombia Calling podcast, Adam.
Yeah, you should call my colleague Jimena Sanchez at WOLA, also knows Colombia even better than I do lately. So yeah, she should get more calls.
In fact, at some point, I'm going to bring up a quote that she gave in an interview because it really is great. But well, first of all, thank you for coming here and spending some of your valuable time here. But let's talk about this. You were just down in Colombia for the first time in a few years. Obvious reasons why. October 3rd till 9th, you were here with Representative Jim McGovern. And I guess that was quite a revealing trip because you went all over. You were in Cali, so the flashpoint, let's say, of the unrest, the demonstrations. You were in Bogota, of course. You went up to Sumapaz. So sort of the old pathway along that, was it the Camino de los Secuestrados, which used to be up through Sumapaz. But tell us a little bit, because I've read your let's say your article that you wrote on your website, the 8 points of this trip. Tell us about it. I mean, why? First of all, Jim McGovern and his interest in Colombia. Let's start right there from the very basics.
Sure. I mean, Congressman McGovern, we've known since he was a congressional staffer, actually. When I first came to Washington in the mid-90s, it was like, call Jim McGovern and see if you can get blah, 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 blah. It's one of their key allies. And he was a key ally because as a legislative staffer in the 80s for a congressman from Boston, he got tasked. I think he always had some interest in Latin America, but he got tasked with doing the congressional investigation of the killing of the Jesuits in El Salvador in 1989. Went down to El Salvador a few times and tried to get to the bottom of what happened. Basically the Salvadoran military killed a bunch of priests. And that, I think, had a really lasting impact on him. And he just had a personal abiding interest in human rights in Latin America, even though representing central and western Massachusetts, there's not a natural tie there. But since then, I'd say Salvador, Cuba, and Colombia have been his main interests. And he's first traveled to Colombia with WOLA, in fact, but before I worked for WOLA back in 2001, in the early days of Plan Colombia. I think I traveled with him for the first time when I worked at the Center for International Policy, took him down, I think it was 2005 or 6. We've done about 8 or 9 trips together. He's been there about 12 times. This was his first trip since we went to Cauca and Cali and Bogota back in 2017. It was my first trip since the very end of 2019. And I had plans to be back in Colombia for a bunch of meetings and a conference in April of 2020, and it all fell through. So it was just as grim, and we'll talk about this, as grim as everything was, it was really good for me to be back. And yeah, we were, we're with a member of Congress who's like shoehorning his agenda between all the other commitments in Congress. The Democrats have the majority. He chairs the committee right now that decides what gets debated on the floor of Congress and what doesn't. So he's got to be in Washington a lot. So we had like 4.5 days on the ground and managed to go to Cali, post Paro Nacional Cali, down briefly, for a day, into Cauca, mainly Santander de Quilichao. Then, yeah, as you said, up most of a day in the Sumapaz region south of Bogota, and then, about a day and a half of meetings in Bogota, like 18 hours a day, just before dawn to late at night, and myself and Jimena and Kim Stanton on his staff trading the interpretation duties, which, when you're on 4 hours sleep isn't as easy as it should be. But it was definitely a successful trip, but a hugely sobering trip. And you mentioned that I did a blog entry. We're basically at WOLA, we're working on, like probably a lot of organizations, doing a bigger report on next month is the 5-year anniversary of the peace accords. So all our energy is going into that. And all I could muster based on what we just saw on the trip was this brief blog entry. I'm glad it got some, it did get some clicks on the web. But yeah, it was just sort of my feelings and impressions more than something that was, cross-referenced and carefully done.
Well, I mean, the 8 points you put, and we'll get into them, but these are your feelings and your observations, but those of us here, we know it. I mean, this is the truth. And but you put it you put it into the erudite language, and you started with the territorial pullback.
Yeah.
I wonder, is that the military pulling back from areas? Because you talk about this, because we've got the 2016 peace accord, and this is what your colleague Carolina Jimenez Sanchez said in an interview: Colombia's peace accord is not weak. It's Duque who insists on weakening it, and then that seems to feed into everything that you saw and observed.
Right. Now, yeah, when I say a territorial pullback, I guess I mainly do mean the military, because the civilian part of the state didn't get to a lot of these areas ever, but soldiers did, to some extent police did. And, I'm the farthest you can imagine from a fan of Alvaro Uribe. But during the, say, Uribe's second term, you did have sort of, and early in, the Santos's first term, you had this sort of high water mark where at least the military was almost everywhere, not the deepest part of the countryside, but every municipality had some presence. There were checkpoints, there were roadblocks, there were a lot of human rights abuses, obviously, that went along with that. And yes, obviously, the military was not followed by doctors, teachers, land titlers, agronomists, or anybody else providing, civilian government support. But the upshot of that was that the number or the amount of territory 12 years ago where you could drive around and see guerrilla banners left up, or Gulf Clan paraphernalia up on the walls, where it was very clear that they had flyers up on public places, like showing what the rules of conduct were. That sort of obvious territorial control and complete lack of any probability of the military even coming through and taking down one of those banners, that was less, significantly less. There has definitely been a pullback. I think the way I put it in the blog entry was, you're on the main road, you turn off the main road, and then you'll hit sort of the last military checkpoint. And after that, you're behind enemy lines. You're in territory controlled by somebody else. It feels like that last checkpoint is a lot closer to the towns and to the main road than it used to be. And I said that, and based on the feeling, really, but it's certainly places like Cauca, Catatumbo, the Bajo Cauca. I mean, that Tumaco. I mean, that's certainly true. You go a little bit upriver, and you're just on your own. And that is more than it was. I think people feel it more too, because the armed groups have fragmented. I cannot name every armed group in Colombia with at least 200 members now. That used to be easy to do. And in many places, yeah, the territory is disputed, or it's weirdly shared. You don't quite know who's in charge. And so if there's no military presence, much less state presence, if there's no military presence, then, that the population is going to feel that competition even more. The pullback may in part be because Colombia has less money. Colombia does not have a tradition of taxing its wealthiest citizens. And so when the price of commodities goes down, its royalties go down, and it has less money to spend on social welfare, but also on things like helicopters. And, the pandemic made that even deeper. Early last year, it was being reported that, Colombia's army has 42 Black Hawk helicopters, fourth largest fleet in the world, but only 15 of those 42 were even functioning. If that's the state the army is in, imagine what state other ministries of the government are in. You sort of have almost a simulacrum of government in a lot of areas. And that was a very strong impression that I had from our brief visit.
And does this resonated most in the sort of Santander de Quilichao area? Sort of,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, Northern Cauca, where you have 3 dissident groups competing, you've got the ELN occasionally, and people claiming to be narcos and mafias. And really, once you get in from the Pan American Highway, you don't see much state presence anymore at all.
As you said, sort of Uribe's final, or his tenure, Santos's tenure, we did see an extension of the military, of the state forces on the main sort of areas of communication, but beyond that. And so we're now saying, of course, and COVID related and economy related, there's been this pullback. This is a concern for a country that's trying to pitch itself for international investment. Of course, all the different extractive policies that it has. You sort of get this feeling, you get off the road, as you say, beyond Santander de Quilichao, and I guess four guys with semi-automatic weapons are the latest criminal armed group. As you say, there's no, you don't know.
They're not in an encampment out in the rural zone somewhere. They are mixed in with the population, often not in uniform. Yeah.
Makes that very, very difficult. So how can you possibly, put them on the same level of importance with whom to negotiate as someone who's got 200 to someone who's got 4? I mean, that's the
4,
truth.
but he might be part of a larger network, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And of course, it's all strategic. And I wanted to bring it in. You did mention, and I'm jumping a few points, but you did mention that these armed groups, the illegal armed groups, seem or appear less to have any sort of skirmishes or confrontations with the military or the state security forces. It's more versus civilians. Explain this a bit, because we expect, and it's the way the government packages it of this new conflict as it's the new universal enemy. But if they're not combating one another, how is this, in their terminology, how does this work?
Right. I mean, they'll combat, these groups may combat each other from time to time, although they prefer, again, to go after civilians in the area they control, going after anybody who's perceived as collaborating with the other groups. But, if you're a group with, I don't know, 300-400 members active in 1 or 2 regions, no real national command, maybe you're loosely part of another network like Gentil Duarte's network or something like that, but you're basically small and you can't call in reinforcements very quickly. Why in God's name would you attack the armed forces? Why would you put your head up there and say, hey, here I am, come get me? I mean, yeah, of course, they do attack the armed forces from time to time, often to make a point, maybe to say, you're not welcome here, we don't want you here, or to maybe retribution for a drug seizure. It could be any local thing usually, but not often enough to end up like, say, Guacho. Remember Guacho in 2018, the head of the Sinistera front in Nariño department? He was a former guerrilla. He led this guerrilla splinter, one of the early dissident groups in the southwest corner of the country. Guacho attacked the military often. He went to Ecuador and attacked the military there. He kidnapped and killed 3 Ecuadorian journalists, which was the big story of the year in Ecuador that year. He drew all this attention to himself, and he was dead by the end of 2018. You can't fight the military if you provoke the military. It makes so much more sense to operate the way organized crime has pretty much always operated in Colombia, but more so lately, which is keep a low profile, maintain your territorial control, make your deals that you have to make the deal with. And for the local, not just military and police, but prosecutors, mayors, governors, anybody else, plata o plomo. You just make sure they feel threatened by you, and otherwise you corrupt and penetrate them. And that's why, like I said, every couple of weeks, you'll see a big attack on a military target. You'll see a landmine field activated, or an ambush, or a car bomb goes off somewhere, and you got several different groups doing this, on a regular basis. But it's not at a very intense level right now. And what you see far more often, I think, are threats and attacks on civilians, on your local social leaders, on politicians they don't get along with. Anybody who's an independent voice is far more unsafe right now. And unfortunately, they're getting it from all sides, because frankly, I find the security forces lately are attacking civilians, or at least confronting, maybe that's a better word, confronting civilians more often, or at least nearly as often as they're confronting the armed groups.
This is something for further on. Would you also say that there's between certain groups and state forces in regions, I don't know, strategic reasons, there's a tacit sort of agreement, that the corruption allows for, well, just let them pass, or they look out for one another?
Yeah, I mean, you see this particularly on key corridors for getting out, drugs or any place there's illicit mining. Rivers like the Atrato or the Naya or the Nicay or all the ones in Nariño, and certainly all the trochas going across into the Venezuelan border. Uh, the boats, the go fast boats, fully laden, seem to get past all the checkpoints quite easily. And people cross back and forth into Venezuela without their cargo getting seized more than very occasionally.
Oh, it's the whole
So,
time.
and
That's the
all of the
whole
local
time.
people say, yeah, that, the military stops and frisks us every time we come through the checkpoint, but these boats somehow manage to go even in the middle of the night. How is that? So clearly, but again, if you are, a corporal or a sergeant or even a second lieutenant somewhere, on some little post along the Mikai River, are you going to give your life to stop some subsidiary of Gentil Duarte, some dissident group that might not even have the same name next year? Are you going to give your life to stop them from getting a few tons through? Or are you just is it easier just to turn your back there in the middle of nowhere with no support?
How do you, I know it's an impossible question, but how do you get to a stage where the military or the authorities say, all right, now, okay, we've got the support of central government, we've got the support of the whole institution, so we are now going to stop these boats. We are now going to get, I guess it's a situation of increase in the military, but also these sort of, let's say, social institutions in these towns to reduce the production of the illicit goods. I don't
Right,
know.
and the military alone can't do that. I mean, what Colombia has relied on heavily, and U.S. aiding Colombia has relied on very heavily, is to have the blue water navy, the people out off the coasts, actually doing most of the interdiction once they have the intelligence. So that boat travels happily down the Naya River, but it has a much greater chance of being stopped in the Pacific. Colombia claims to have interdicted more than 500 tons of cocaine last year, which is pretty stunning if it's true. Maybe less than half of the total, but it's still a significant portion. But a large fraction of that happened out in the open ocean and not in areas where people live and where the military is mixed in with the population.
I always wonder what happens to the what they
I
impound,
don't know
because
either.
I'd like to, we do see the images of the sort of incinerating blocks and so on. There does seem to be so much. I'd love to know. I do think some ends up back in the hands of its original owners, I think. But
I've never seen good reporting on that. Yeah, it does seem to go into a bit of a black hole, though, doesn't it?
Yeah, I once got in touch with I don't know, one of these government agencies, and was sort of pinballed around different places. Nobody really wanted. I'd have to find someone willing to speak off the record on
It's
that
something
one.
that you'd want to be utterly transparent about. You'd almost want to have public burnings where you weigh everything and account for all of it. But no, it's, I mean, some of it's kept as evidence for cases and things like that. There's an interesting, just here in the United States, our border agency, the Customs and Border Protection, there was an Inspector General report last year about the disposition of seized cocaine at the US-Mexico border. And yeah, there's some cocaine from 15 years ago. There's apparently still in the evidence room, just sitting there waiting to be used for evidence. I mean,
does cocaine go bad after? Does it have a sell-by date?
I have to imagine it does, but yeah, it's probably a pretty stable chemical though.
All right. Well, you touched on something again in that sort of last bit we're talking about, the people afraid of the security forces, and this, of course, has surged in recent years. I think there's always been a degree of fear, aside from when you get sort of, I don't know, these efforts of the soldiers giving you the thumbs up on the highways and so on. Right. I said, okay, that's fine, but I think in the spectrum of the paro nacional, there has been a huge increase and lack of confidence in state, not just the security forces, but institutions. I mean, you see any opinion poll, and people have lost their faith, and there's all sorts of issues behind this. But the military and the police I feel less safe when I see more, and right where
Hmm.
I live, in a very
Hmm.
well-heeled part of town, in fact, you visited, we've got more and more military police around. It's because there
Interesting.
have been, a couple of, I don't know, it's like phone snatchings by guys on motorcycles. But it suggests to me that there's greater insecurity, and I don't feel safe with these guys with big weapons. I don't know. I mean, when you were out in Sumapaz, did the people feel less safe? I mean, it's a kind of it's kind of a delicate line there, because it's always been sort of in this tug of war between sides, and geographically located between the city and then of course the altiplano and then the jungle.
Yeah, I mean, some military and some security forces frighten the population, and others are really just sort of scarecrows. I mean, if they catch you doing something bad, then you're in trouble. But otherwise, you've got, a 19-year-old kid with a gun almost as big as they are, doing the best they can, and they don't really instill fear. So in Sumapaz, I mean, we did go through two ranks of checkpoints on our way to the town of San Juan. And I don't know if they made people feel any safer. But again, like scarecrows, they're sort of showing the state presence on the road. As you go further south and as you get closer to Meta, we were told that there is more presence of FARC dissidents. Gentil Duarte's people are moving up and moving in. At least we went about 2.5 hours south to San Juan Sumapaz, and there people, it's something on people's minds that the dissidents are nearby, but we did not hear that there'd been a real wave of threats yet. But there's concern that they're growing and they're coming. It is a key corridor into Bogota, and just a couple of checkpoints with high mountain brigade soldiers in their tents are not probably enough to stop that from becoming a corridor between Bogota and Meta. So yeah, I mean, it seemed to be something that was still incipient. It was something that, with a team of people from the mayor's office and with, that was about all we needed to feel safe enough just driving with a member of Congress and nothing, untoward happening. The U.S. Embassy did not send personnel along with us because they had enough security concerns not to bother, but they're pretty cautious.
Yeah, they are on the side of caution, and fair play from their position. Now, I think it's time to address this. We are coming to the end of 2021, and it was 70 something massacres already this year. A huge increase in environmental defenders being killed, murdered, with 2 years in a row, 2019, 2020, by Global Witness. They've reported on that. Colombia, the worst in the world. Human rights defenders on the front line.
Yeah, the last UN report had about 150 so far this year.
Signees of the peace accords, so integrating ex-guerrillas are on the list as well. So you allude to the fact you're doing old school human rights work again. What does that mean? You're down on the ground saying to people, be careful?
No, I mean, it's, the longtime colleague Winifred Tate, who worked at WOLA like 20 years ago and then went on to be an anthropologist. Her first book was it was an anthropology study of the human rights movement in Colombia, and she titled it Counting the Dead. And it feels like that's what we're doing again. We're either counting the dead or taking really painful testimonies from people who've been victims, newly victimized victims. Now, I mean, we've been talking about killings of social leaders and killings of ex-combatants the whole time. I mean, since the peace accord was signed, but we've seen that number increase steadily year on year on year. But during that early period of the peace process, 2015 to 2018 or so, we had this luxury of talking about proposals, state presence in the countryside and crop substitution and, how we can improve the government's protection programs and how we can improve participation and make Colombia, help Colombia on its path to becoming a quote unquote normal country. And we've definitely seen a reversion there. We are right back. This trip felt like it could have been in 2009. We're once again going to places where people have been victimized and hearing testimonies. And of course, in Cali was some of the most vivid. And those doing the victimizing were either the police or armed civilians alongside the police.
That to me is shocking. And when I see people, when you talk about this, you see people defending, and what's the guy's name who has been sort of the poster boy for that, Andres Escobar, for taking out his gun and sort of saying, "I'm defending my neighborhood." I was like, well, no, this is why you have a police force. This is why, and so bigger questions need to be asked around this, and an armed society, and if a police force is behaving as if it can't control a situation. Why is this going on? And now, of course, he's very much changed his image. Someone must have got onto him he's now at town halls talking about security and support for the police.
He's launching himself a political career.
It seems like it. I think he might end up being like the VP candidate for Maria Fernanda Cabal, because he's always at her town hall meetings. But with her recent haul of 5% of desired votes, we can still hope that she won't get anywhere.
She gets a lot of media though, doesn't she?
She gets a lot of, because she's that figure who says we expect her to say something outrageous.
We had one of those in 2015, and he turned out pretty well for him.
Yes. We don't. Yeah, let's. It doesn't bear thinking about. But we all know who she is, and that's the reality. And that's. Bad press is press, especially when you're on TV the whole time. Especially when like you say, you're out in San Juan de Sumapaz, or you're out in Santander de Quilichao, who they most likely won't recognize an Alejandro Gaviria or a Sergio Fajardo, but they will know who Cabal is. And that's the great big difference. Why are you going to vote for an unknown face? And it's terrifying. And that sort of leads us in. It's like 2022 is a phenomenally important and worrying year. So much so that in the course of, if I do any consulting or articles, I wonder if I want to be here with my family. That's the truth. I'm not going to lie. What do you feel? You said it's a sobering trip down to Colombia, and it's like being here in 2009. 2022, are we expecting more of the same, increased problems, violence? What could you say from your professional and personal standpoint?
Yeah, if you just want to talk about the security environment around the campaign, it's pretty fair to guess that in parts of the country where traditional political elites, where large landowners, political bosses, la maquinaria have always run the show, if they feel threatened by upstarts, say, be that Petro or even somebody from the center left who's not associated with them, they don't fight clean. They don't fight clean. And you add that non-clean fighting element, which perhaps, Cabal and Andres Escobar and those guys represent, and add that to this mix of small armed groups who are also fighting for control of territory and corridors, and they want friendly faces in the mayor's, or rather we're not doing mayor elections this year. They want friendly faces in Congress and in the presidency. Yeah, there could be some real violence, probably not in the more solidly governed parts of the country, like, the major cities. But again, smaller cities, rural areas that have long been under the sway of traditional political powers, that could be quite ugly.
So kind of like you say, the places that voted in favor of the peace accord, the ones that were so hammered during the hardest years and continual years of the conflict, are the ones likely again to suffer the most.
Or places that voted no in the plebiscite also, where the traditional parties have often ruled and people are quite conservative. But if there is a populist upstart in, I don't know, Pamplona, Norte de Santander, which is a place that voted heavily no, if there's a populist upstart or somebody on the left or center left who's doing quite well, and they have a movement, they would be quite in danger there. I don't mean to pick on Pamplona. That's the first place that came to mind.
It's curious. I always looked at Pamplona and thinking it's student city. How come? I mean, but then you've got your traditional parties and the border area and the financial clout of Cucuta, and
I mean, it's remarkable. We were just talking about how Colombia's state is absent from so many areas, right? Maybe you'll see a military patrol come through, but what's not absent? Go a month before the elections and look at where the political parties are quite, the national political parties have quite, a presence and a base and are able to put banners and campaign freely. And, that relies on support from traditional power, whoever that is in that area. And if that power feels threatened by what looks to be a bit of a wave election that could see some really dramatic change in who runs things, they're not going to fight clean.
I talked recently to the environmental defender Isabel Cristina Zuleta, who's sort of Rios Vivos and Ituango, the dam there. She's from Ituango, and she was displaced age 14. She must be in her 20s now. And she said that, the traditional political parties around where she campaigns the most, so the Cauca River, are feeling threatened. Hence,
no doubt,
the rise in assassinations in that area, and of course the back and forth between different, armed groups. So I mean, she does mention it. It's like we are threatening their status quo, and
right.
You kind of hope that the threats can be just worked out peacefully, through a political means. But as you say, they're not going to play
institutions.
Yeah, they're not going to play clean. So I worry about 2022. And I'm not a Petrista at all, but because I find him noxious on so many fronts. And don't get me wrong, I think he represents something important in the country.
I thought he was a good senator. It worried me, like in the first year of his mayorship, how many people exited, his mayor, his government. And so, I worry that Gustavo Petro is not paying enough attention to strengthening institutions and is looking for ways to do end runs around them. I mean, if he's elected, it won't be the end of the world for Colombia, but his personality is not managerial. Let's put it that way.
It really isn't. He doesn't know how to manage people, as you say. I ended up working for a couple of weeks for him way back in the day. I interviewed him once as well, and he doesn't come across well. He doesn't come across showing any humility as well, and that's something that's quite
you see a lot of leaders in Latin America right now who are like that.
You get the inevitable comparisons with AMLO in Mexico, Obrador.
The left populist.
Inevitable. But I just sort of concern if it's him and someone else, and I don't know.
It's almost definitely going to be him in the second round unless something dramatic happens. But I I asked a lot of people this when I was obviously in my few days in Colombia, and sort of I heard two things. One, that Petro could beat anybody from the center left. No, I'm sorry. Petro could be beaten by anybody from the right, the center right, or the center left, but not somebody from the far right like Cabal, that he probably could beat Cabal. Although I had some people say, I don't know, people are really afraid of Petro. But then I heard others say that no, Colombians want change so badly that Petro could beat somebody like Fajardo or Gaviria, and probably could beat somebody from the far right. Although the general consensus was like somebody from the center right, probably not from Uribismo, who's felt safe enough for a majority of Colombians, could probably still beat Petro in the second round. But I don't know how they govern, but they could probably beat him.
Yeah, that kind of feeling of security that got Duque in. I mean, that's it, isn't it? And I know people. It's like,
people fear chaos and disorder, even if they need change really badly.
And you've got, Alvaro Uribe the other day making, when Petro talked about the expropriation, I think, of Uribe's lands, to make it productive. It was quite amusing. He said all of these things because he said, you're not even growing yucca or plátanos. It's just for your unproductive cattle farming. And of course, he got up and said, I'm a finquero what do you say? I'm a landowner. I'm a cattle farmer, but that's my profession. This is communism. This is this, and of course
I
that
love it.
resonates. And Uribe,
They'll probably both messages resonated. Yeah.
yeah, Uribe, he's got that thing as well. He speaks and he dominates the headlines and dominates the national conversation. So it's always a concern, these things. And you sort of wish that, well, okay, Petra, that's quite amusing. It's got you back on the headlines, but you're now also, you'll be driving people to the other side with that kind of thing, especially, people, even with a small amount of land, who think, oh, this is communism. This will be Venezuela. The Castro Chavista revolution is coming.
Yeah, I guess expropriation is a dirty word.
It is a dirty word, and that, but can't we just put it as agrarian reform? Point 1 on the peace accord. We do need this, right? We do need a better land management in Colombia. I think the be all and end all of problems,
and ultimately maybe you can hammer away at the rural issue in a country that's 80% urban, so a lot of your voters are in cities.
Yeah. So around your travel, and we can't take up too much more of your time, but around your travel, what do people tell you that they want in these particularly sort of dangerous, these uncertain areas where we don't know who's entirely in command, ruling? There's this sort of minimal state presence, and we say state with inverted commas. There's like a little village clinic and a police station, if that. What do people tell you that they want? How do they see the solution to the violence that is in their community?
And everybody really starts with the peace accord. I mean, this was laid out already in like 100-something pages. What was, or 200-something pages, what was the blueprint? And people say right off the bat that we have to implement this accord. This was designed for our zones of the country. And people, the subtext of what people say is, we need comprehensive state presence. We need our government to actually be here. We never see anybody from our government. We are here on our own, abandoned. Now, if you are in a conflictive area, if you can't just get up and say, we need the state here. Also, frankly, people say they want the state, but they're quite suspicious of this state. But if you were to get up in Buenos Aires, Cauca, and say, we need the government here, you might as well just step in front of a moving bus. That's suicide. You can't say that. So what people will say, in addition to implement the peace accord, is we need a humanitarian accord. We need all armed actors to at least agree to a series of humanitarian minimums that gets the civilian population out of the conflict. People talk about that a lot in Chocó. There's a very advanced proposal. There's similar in Arauca, I think Catatumbo, and they were talking about it in Cauca. That's attractive. I have no idea how you enforce it. As soon as somebody violates that and kills a civilian, I mean, where do you go? You just say, don't do that again, and you move on, basically. There's no enforcement mechanism for it. But ultimately, some verification mechanism would be good. Some umpire who says, no, Frente Carlos Patino, you did this and you were wrong, would be, I guess, useful. But that's where people are right now. If you can't publicly call for the state, or you simply distrust this state, have General Vargas send some police in, that might not make anything better. If you distrust this state, that's what you're reduced to calling for, a humanitarian accord.
It's quite desperate, isn't it? This a humanitarian accord.
It's last ditch. Yeah,
it really is.
Last resort.
Well, and then finally, how do you? Okay, we can blame a lot on COVID. We can blame, and this government will continue to do so, and then the next one will blame this government, and you know how it works. But the 4 years of Duque, we can't say but there's any measure of success here. The peace accord has been weakened. It has been strangled for money. Yes, right. COVID has played a part, but it was already on the way down the drain with this government, surrounding himself with people that he feels superior to. And so there's no pushback. There's clearly no pushback. He's got a whole room of people say, yes, you're right. And so there's just no debate, is there? And only recently there's been the Colombian state has been found responsible for this, the most dreadful attack on the journalist Ginette Bedoya, the international Inter-American Court on Human Rights 21 or 20 years later. And Duque cynically stands up and says, yes, we will adhere to everything. This is right. No journalist, no woman must undergo or must be affected, must be attacked on this level. And you're like, these are, I kind of say,
this is the same government that had its representative at the American court get up and turn off their Zoom and in the middle of one of the hearings earlier this year because they thought the judges were unfair.
Unfair. Are we still in a playground? I mean, you're not playing fair. This is a serious human rights abuse carried out with the inherent corruption of the state. The prison, the military must have looked another way, and these are the same guys that we have now. So I don't know. I worry about this, and the word I want to keep coming back to, and that you used, was sobering. Your sobering trip. And so to bring this to a close, because you've spoken so amply about the situation, to bring this to a close, how do you feel? What are your overarching feelings for Colombia in the short term, the immediate future?
In the medium to long term, depending on the 22 election result, I feel okay. Not great, but I do see I think civil society is, despite all the threats, super organized. I see a lot of new faces in politics, maybe even more than we have in the United States, who are reformist, but they've got to weather a real storm in the next few years. This lack of resources, this simulacrum of a government, this increasing polarization, huge number of people in poverty, worsening inequality. I mean, they've got to get through this, and that's going to happen at a time of vastly increasing violence against civilians, some of it committed by state actors with impunity. So yeah, they've got to weather this storm, and whether they manage to or not will determine whether they recover quickly and get a sort of even close to the path that the peace accords had set 5 years ago. All that said, I have to say a word about my government. I don't think that I was not given any impression that the United States government gets this. I think that they are, captured is too strong a word, but extremely strongly influenced by their counterparts in the Duque government and in the Colombian armed forces, security forces, given this feeling that, no, this is still a success story. There's a few bumps in the road, but everything's okay. This peace accord was badly designed anyway, so it's better that we just go with legality. And I'm not sure if they really capture the extent to which because they don't go to these areas, the extent to which the Colombian state is becoming just sort of a shadow or a pantomime of a state in a lot of these areas. I hope they get that sense, but I don't think they're getting good information. And at the same time, here in the United States, and particularly in our defense sector, the war on terror, it's around still, but it's not really a thing to the extent that it was. I mean, the pullback from Afghanistan certainly underlines that. The real concern that people talk about every day now is a competition with China and to a lesser extent with Russia. And if you see Latin America as a chessboard for great power competition, like we did during the Cold War again, your instinct is to cling desperately to the few countries that are willing to completely work with you, give you full military access, and deny that access to China and other powers. And Colombia checks all those boxes, which makes them even less likely to want to challenge Colombia on issues that actually are, if allowed to fester, are going to make Colombia even less stable. So in the name of stability, they're actually failing to see a lot of the elements of instability in Colombia.
I never really got the impression that the Biden administration was going to pay too much attention to what's going on in Colombia. It does seem like a bit of a poisoned chalice as well. I mean, in truth, I mean, it's such a complex issue, and when you've got Venezuela alongside, you said the China, the Russia, of course, the pullout with Afghanistan, Colombia falls far down the pecking order. Of course, then the migrants up at the border, which is such a visible issue. I mean, it's so tangible for many people, and that's the great big difference. Colombia is see
Now,
you as
you've got
far
Venezuela
away.
on fire. You've got 200,000 migrants showing up at the U.S.-Mexico border every day, every month. Sorry, you've got Central America crime out of control. Mexico has a higher homicide rate than Colombia. Colombia still maybe, when you're looking at the chessboard from a distance, looks like an island of stability. I mean, Duque is a conservative, but he's not an authoritarian populist like Bukele or Bolsonaro or Chavez or Maduro. So yeah, Colombia, you're right. It doesn't rise to the top. Maybe you see a lot of blinking lights on the dashboard, but other countries already have, the car is actually on fire. So yeah, it doesn't rise. And so when the police kill 40 something people in a couple of months of protests and disappear more, you may not be as forceful as you should be in your criticism of the police's performance.
Worrying.
Yeah,
Definitely worrying. Well, on that note, I think we'll bring it to an end.
Told you I wasn't going to be cheerful.
Well, I don't have a lot to be cheerful about. When I think of consulting and stuff, you're like, I don't really see too much light at the moment. But we have to discuss it. I mean, we have to get it out there in the public fora to be able to discuss these things. And if it means that we have to say it in English on a podcast or into international publications, then so be it.
Absolutely.
Because from beyond, and offices such as yourself at the Washington office and Latin America, you do put pressure. There is pressure applied, and then of course with Representative McGovern, this is good news that he's coming down, because it does.
I'm very glad that he did. Yeah,
I missed the press conference because I had another appointment, but which I probably could have missed.
The live stream is online at a couple places, so yeah.
I might watch it, but it's now passed on. But so listen, let me take this moment to say, thank you so much to Adam Isacson, to yourself, Director for Defense Oversight. I have to read that out. I have to look at that title so I don't get it wrong. It's quite.
I don't know what to call myself. It's the best I've come up with, because I try to oversee military assistance. All
right, there you go. So, well, thank you so much for your time, for coming on the 400th episode of Colombia Calling. And well, I hope when you're next down in Colombia, you have a little bit more time to spend, with us lowly freelance journalists and discuss.
Will do.
Discuss a bit more the situation, and hopefully next trip is more positive. Let's say.
I hope so too, and it will be soon. Now that I broke the seal, we can travel more often. I'll be there in a few months.
All right, very good.
If not less.
Excellent. Well, thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode 400. It's quite a landmark to get this far. I realize.
I don't know how you do that.
I don't know either. I think the first 150 weren't listened to, so I'll be honest about it. But it's great to keep going, and I've been given this real boost with the journalist Emily Hart doing the news segment each.
That's right. Yeah, she's great.
Really given us some sort of impetus, and so I'm very grateful.
You're weekly though, right?
Yeah, we are weekly.
Do you ever miss a week, or are you just like clockwork?
Well, we take a couple of weeks off at Christmas.
But that's it. I mean, but you announce that in advance,
Yeah, but no, week in, week out.
We have WOLAs whenever I can, so sometimes it's like, no, too busy. Sorry.
I think I have less to do than you. I think you're busier than me covering the border, Mexico, Central America, the rest of the Americas. I think you're busier than I am. And now that both of my kids are at school, I have time again. So
that's great. That's great. Yeah, mine's at school too now, but mine's older though, 17. So it's a lot easier.
He hides in his cave. But thank you again for this. It's been, as always, an excellent conversation, and we've really put it into context. You too. And so thank you to everyone for tuning in. This has been episode 400. I've been Richard McColl talking to Adam Isacson. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.